So, good afternoon, everyone. It's my privilege to welcome you all to the second session of the Daksha Conclave, our flagship event which aims to promote dialogue on contemporary challenges in law and policy and also bring our students closer to the leaders in the academia and the industry. Our second panel today is on a very contemporary topic, the BITs. As all of you all must be aware, the past couple of weeks we've been reading in the papers about the crane arbitration that India lost, and we've suffered a decree for 1.2 billion US dollars. And this is something that has come out of a bilateral investment treaty that we had with the UK. This is, of course, not the first time that such an event has happened in India. In the past, too, we have faced adverse decrees from arbitrations which were under the BIT. So going forward, this is a topic which is very sticky and controversial. And it's not just India, but a lot of third world countries are now wondering what to do with a BIT framework. We have a model law for this purpose, and there is much that is left to be desired in that. And it's my privilege to welcome a stellar panel to discuss this issue. I will welcome the moderator, Professor Rajesh Babu, who is a professor of law at IIM Calcutta. He is a lawyer by training, and he has almost 2 decades of industry experience in the industry as well as in the academia. He has his PhD and MPhil in international from JNU, which was followed by a postdoctoral fellowship at the Geneva Institute. He has extensively published on a wide array of legal topics, and his current research interests are on international economic law, dispute settlement, and international corporate liability. Professor Rajesh, welcome to the Daksha panel. I will hand over the session to you, and you can take it forward through here.
Thank you, Mahesh. A very good morning to all of you. Dear Daksha fellows, co-panelists, and other learned colleagues in this panel discussion. Allow me to thank the organizers for your kind invitation to be part of the panel discussion on the very contemporary, very hot topic, Model Bilateral Investment Treaty 2016, balancing between host state rights to regulate and the promotion of foreign investment. So thank you very much. So let me put briefly the topic in context as according to my understanding. Right? So the standard of protection for investors, foreign investors, and the right of the host state to regulate has probably been one of the most contested areas of international law. The topic for our discussion today is not just a concern of or challenge for India alone, but a global challenge faced by a multitude of states. The debate could possibly be traced back to the 19th century Latin American countries' argument for ensuring primacy of national law over international law in regulation and protection of foreign investment, and their challenges to the colonial period uneven treaties and contracts. The debate and assertions probably continued with the newly independent states of Asia and Africa reclaiming their sovereignty over their natural resources and the right to regulate. So some of these reflections one can possibly see in many of the 60s and 70s UN General Assembly resolutions like New International Economic Order, PSNR, Permanent Sovereignty of Natural Resources, Charter of Economic Rights and Duties of States. But having said that, since the late 80s to 90s, one see a proliferation, the increasing popularity of BITs, bilateral investment treaties, which became or dictated to a large extent the key international instrument that set the standard for protection of foreign investment. One can again has been characterized, at least from the perspective of developing countries. One can say that BITS is a reflection of the economic power imbalance. One, provide higher standard of protection for foreign investment property, which was argued as necessary for attracting investment. Shrinking policy and regulatory space for host state in terms of foreign investment. Bypassing of domestic adjudication process in favor of international adjudication, expanding scope and higher standard of compensation for expropriation, and finally, and probably one of the most debated area of the clear pro-investment investor interpretation of BITS in the investment arbitration process. India, of course, had its own share of issues since the 90s, starting with the Dabhol Enron Power Project. And then the turning point came in the context of White Industries Australia, and then the most recent episodes of course, there are many cases pending against India in the recent times, but the most important, the recent ones being Vodafone and Cranes arbitration. So international community, at least in the contemporary context, one can see that international community seems to have taken a cognizance of this growing, what you call it, a discontent, or some as even someone calls it as backlash against what is called as investor-state dispute settlement for various reasons. And one can say that probably one of the major reasons, the first reason would be, is the inconsistency of the decisions rendered by arbitration panels established under BIPs and investment provisions of RTAs. Secondly, probably perhaps the most important, the very rigid view that panels have tended to take, even when the host country acted as a result of economic crisis. And third, being very much connected to the second point, seeming insensitivity of arbitration panels to signals that corruption or incompetency might have been involved in the original negotiation or subsequent renegotiation of agreements that give rise to disputes. So it is in this historical context that one must, and the current developments, that one must look at India's bilateral model bilateral investment treaty and the balancing of the rights and obligations. So without further ado, we have very competent, very learned 3 panel members here. I will introduce them one by one as we go by when I invite them for the further discussion. We have Dr. Prabhash Ranjan, we have Kshama Loya, and we have Rishabh Gupta. Allow me to call the first panelist to kick off the discussion with a historical note. Dr. Prabhash Ranjan. Let me introduce him briefly. Prabhash is working as an assistant professor of law at the South Asia University, New Delhi. He is a PhD from King's College London and studied in King's College London School of Law Doctoral Fellowship. He studied at the School of Oriental and African Studies and University College of London for LLM on a British Shawning Scholarship, and holds a degree in law and economics and law from the University of Delhi. Prabhash has been a visiting fellow at the Lotte Pratt Center for International Law, Cambridge University, University of Brooklyn, India, associate professor at National Law University, Jodhpur, assistant professor at NUJS, Kolkata, and he has been visiting faculty at Sydney, University of Sydney, ILI, IIFT, TERI, etc., etc. And probably if you can name a few people who have written extensively on international investment law, Prabhash should be one of that person. He has extensively published on international investment law and international trade in leading international referred journals like George Washington International Law Review, ICSID Review, Northwestern Journal of International Law and Business, Journal of World Trade, to mention a few. So Prabhash, the floor is yours. Please kickstart the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rajesh, for that very generous introduction. I'm extremely grateful to the organizers for their kind invitation, and I'm very happy that you have included discussion on investment treaties as part of your conclave. Very happy to be with my co-panelists, Kshama and Rishabh. It's rare to get people from academia and industry as part of the same panel. This is not really a tradition that has picked up in India. And therefore, I'm also delighted that the organizers have chosen the panel in such a fashion that you represent the views of academicians and also of industry and practitioners. Okay, in about 20 minutes that I have, I would like to give you a broad overview about India's BIT program till the point of India enacting or adopting its model bilateral investment treaty in early 2016. But before I come to India's experience as regards BITs are concerned, I would like to spend some time telling you about the larger political economy in which investment treaties have flourished in the last 5 to 6 decades. Rajesh has already talked about this in his introductory remarks, and I would like to build upon this a little more. As you would know, the first investment treaty was signed in 1959, and this was between Pakistan and West Germany. Now, the original idea or intent behind signing investment treaties by the developed world or by the Western world at that point of time was largely to protect their foreign investment in their erstwhile colonies. Now, these erstwhile colonies were not under their political control, and they were fearful of their investment getting expropriated or nationalized, or being subjected to other kinds of regulatory measures. And therefore, there was a need to create some kind of international legal instrument through which developing countries could be held accountable as regards their conduct for regulating foreign investment is concerned. Customary international law on this issue has remained uh, sorry, I think there was some disturbance. The customary international law on this issue has remained vague, some of it, as was pointed out by Rajesh. And therefore, the endeavor was to develop international treaty law by which you can create legal standards on which you can hold countries or governments accountable. Now, India did not sign an investment treaty early on. India signed its first investment treaty in 1994. And if you look at the trajectory of evolution of bilateral investment treaties from 1959 till the late 1980s, you would find that about 300 to 400 investment treaties were signed in the first 3 decades, which was not a huge number compared to what happened in the 1990s. Now, there's a reason behind this, and this is where I want to bring in the political economy aspect. After the Second World War, the world had kind of adopted what can be described as a model of embedded liberalism, where the countries were conscious of opening up their markets, but at the same time, they wanted to retain as much sovereign space as possible to regulate these markets. And therefore, there was an attempt to kind of strike a balance between free market and state regulation. Now, this model of embedded liberalism, as political scientist John Ruggie described, was followed in the first 3 decades. I mean, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which was negotiated in 1947, is a very good example of this model of embedded liberalism, trying to strike a balance between two competing values. On the one hand, free market, on the other hand, state regulation. Now, this model worked quite well in the Western world till about late 1970s. But after the oil crisis and oil shock in the 1970s, there was a realization that this model was not delivering faster economic growth. And as a result, there was a momentum towards moving to an alternative or a slightly different economic model. And there were several political developments which led towards this political model. For example, the victory of Ronald Reagan in the US, and then you had Margaret Thatcher in UK, who were champions of free markets in that sense. And the world started to move away from embedded liberalism to neoliberalism, where the mantra was that you need to deregulate markets, you need to privatize public sector undertakings, you need to bring in greater market forces into all kinds of economic activities, with the state playing a limited role. Now, during this sphere of neoliberalism, you had a proliferation of bilateral investment treaties. If you look at the statistics of UNCTAD, for example, you would find that, as I said, in the first 3 decades, you hardly had about 300 odd investment treaties. But in just a 10-year period, from 1989 till 1999, the number of investment treaties rose to close to 1900. And this was also the time, we should not forget, when there was collapse of communism. there was a decisive victory in favor of the US model versus the communist or the Russian model or the USSR model at that point of time. And there was a greater realization, even in the developing world, including in countries like India, that import substitution industrialization or insulating ourselves from the global economy is not going to help us. And therefore, there is a need to integrate ourselves with the global economy. So there was a kind of a triumph of a particular economic model that US and its allies had championed all along the Cold War. And we can say, at least at that point of time, that this battle was decisively won by US because it led to the propagation of the same economic model across a large number of countries. So this is the larger political economy which we have to keep in mind in order to understand how bilateral investment treaties have proliferated in the last 3 to 4 decades. Now, India's story is very interesting because, as I said, and as I have argued in my book also, if we look at India's tryst with investment treaties, we can sort of divide it into 3 phases. The first phase is after independence till about 1990, when India followed what can be described as an import substitution model. India did not integrate itself with global economy. Foreign investment was looked at with suspicion because of our colonial experience. And then in 1991, because of a severe balance of payment crisis, India started to liberalize its economy, started to woo foreign investors. And as part of this, India started signing a large number of bilateral investment treaties. Now, when India started signing these treaties, the intent was, or the objective was, A, to promote foreign investment, and B, to protect foreign investment. So there was a belief that if you sign investment treaties, you would see greater foreign investment flowing in. Now, this sort of begs the question that whether investment treaties actually translate into greater foreign investment inflows. Rishabh is going to talk about this, so I will not talk about this. But the presumption that India and several other countries had was that signing investment treaties will result into greater foreign investment inflows. And this belief gave the impetus to the Indian BIT program. And from the early 1990s till about mid-2000, India went on a BIT signing spree, if one can say, and signed BITs with a large number of European countries, and also started signing BITs with developing countries. For example, India signed a BIT with China in 2006. Apart from the investment treaties, India also started entering into free trade agreements containing chapters on investment. So 4 such free trade agreements were signed, which have a full-fledged chapter on investment. These agreements are with Asian countries: Singapore, Japan, Korea, and Malaysia. However, from 2010 onwards, one can say that the Indian BIT program entered into the 3rd phase. So the first phase was the phase of refusal, when India did not embrace investment treaties. The second phase from 1991 till 2010 was the phase of acceptance, when India started embracing investment treaties and started signing investment treaties in the belief that these investment treaties are good for them. And then from 2010 onwards, we have entered into a 3rd phase, which I call as the backlash, or the phase of backlash. And the reason for this is that in 2010, India lost a case to an Australian corporation in a case known as White Industries versus India. And this case, in a way, was the starting point of India's backlash against investment treaties. Now, let me explain to you what do I mean by the term backlash. As Rajesh mentioned, this is a term which is often used to talk about the reaction of a large number of countries, not just developing countries or not just third world states, but also developed countries, to investment treaties. Now, this backlash can be understood, or is understood, in different ways. For example, one way to understand this backlash is that some countries have pulled out of the investment treaty system completely. So they have terminated their investment treaties. They have walked out of the ICSID system. South Africa is a leading example. And what they have done is they have instead adopted or enacted a domestic law for the protection of foreign investment, which they offer as an alternative to bilateral investment treaties. On the other hand, there are some countries which have reacted to the system in a very harsh fashion, but have not walked out of the system completely. And India would fall in this category. So India's reaction to the White Industries case, and not just White Industries, to a large number of cases that have come up against India after White Industries, has been that India started unilaterally terminating its bilateral investment treaties, and has adopted a new model investment treaty. And now India wants to negotiate the new investment treaties with countries based on its 2016 model investment treaty. To what extent India will be successful in doing that is something that we will have to wait and see. India has been successful in persuading around 4 or 5 countries in accepting the Indian model BIT. But these countries are not really big exporters of capital to India. So India's real challenge would be whether it can convince European Union, or whether it can convince the US, or whether it can convince other countries that export capital to India to accept the Indian model investment treaty. Now, before I close, the other point that I want to discuss with you, and this is something which I think does not get adequate attention. I'm not going to talk about the features of the model BIT, because that is something which I presume Shama will talk about, and we can reflect on this in discussions. But there is one feature which I want to talk about, which is often not discussed at length. And that is the reason why several BIT claims have been brought against India. So I talked about White Industries. After White Industries, there were several foreign corporations who brought cases against India because of the Supreme Court verdict cancelling the 2G licenses, the second generation telecom licenses. This was followed by cases brought against India because of cancellation of spectrum licenses. Devas, for example, there are 2 cases, and both the cases India has lost. Likewise, there were cases which have been brought up because of the retrospective application of tax laws on companies such as Vodafone and Kane Energy. Now, if we look at the contestation against the investment regime, it is often argued by several scholars in India and outside that investment treaties curtail the right to regulate of the host state. They come in way of the host state trying to adopt regulatory measures for the protection of environment, for the protection of public health, or for achieving other public interest objectives. And therefore, these investment treaties need to be relooked or terminated, or need to be altered, etc. However, as I argue in my book, that if we carefully look through all the BIT claims that have come up against India, none of these claims were brought because India was exercising its genuine right to regulate to achieve a particular public interest objective, such as environment, health protection, etc. All these cases have come up because, in my personal opinion, and I presume many of you would not agree with me, in my personal opinion, all these cases have come up because of what I call as reckless or bad regulatory conduct. I mean, let us look at all these cases very briefly, one by one. Why did the White Industries case come up? The White Industries case came because the Indian judiciary for 9 long years could not decide on a particular international commercial arbitration award. Now, you may say that is how Indian judiciary functions, that we have our court system is very slow, etc., etc. But that's not really an argument. The point is that you could not decide on a case for 9 years, and that triggered the White Industries claim. So if that case was dealt efficiently by the judiciary, that case would not have come up. Likewise, the ruling of the Supreme Court cancelling the second generation telecom licenses. The Supreme Court did not even consider in its judgment whether any of this is going to have any implications as regards India's BIT obligations are concerned. This again goes to show that perhaps BITs have not been completely internalized, even by the judiciary, forget just the executive. Next, if we look at the cases that the 2 cases that have come up that were brought by Devas and the Deutsche Telekom case, Both these cases came up because we cancelled spectrum licenses without following due process. If you read the arbitral awards in both these cases, which are now in public domain, you would find that India has been found guilty of the fair and equitable treatment provision in the two BITs, and the reason is that India cancelled the spectrum licenses without following due process. Likewise, if we look at the cases, which Vodafone and Kane Energy have brought, both these cases came up because you amended the law retrospectively, which I think there is a wide consensus that it was a bad thing to do. Interestingly, the party which was in opposition at that point of time criticized it very severely. But when that party came to power, they did not do anything to amend the law and make it prospective. And if they had done that, as I have argued, then this problem would not have occurred, and we would not have to face these two cases that we have lost now. So my argument is that if we carefully look at all these cases, we would see that these cases have come up because of bad regulatory state conduct. And if India was careful in exercising its regulatory conduct, it is quite possible that many of these cases would not have arisen. So I'll end by saying that I don't want to leave you with an impression that I'm an unabashed cheerleader of foreign corporations or of foreign investors or of investment treaties. In my scholarly work or in my writings, I have argued that there are problems with investment treaties, undoubtedly, and those problems need to be rectified. But in my personal opinion, Indian reaction has been to move from one extreme to the other extreme. So in 1990s, when we went on signing investment treaties, we signed investment treaties which were very neoliberal in their outlook. They gave all kinds of assurances and protection to the investors without providing adequate space for the host state to regulate. And there was a need to bring the pendulum somewhere in the middle. But unfortunately, what has happened is that now India has gone to the other end, where it does not want to recognize rights of foreign investors and want to retain as much sovereign space as possible. So now we have to argue for again bringing the pendulum in the middle, but not from this direction, but from the opposite direction. These are some thoughts which I wanted to share with you. And if there are any questions and during discussions, we can discuss more about these aspects. Thank you very much. Rajesh, it's back to you.
Yeah. Thanks a lot for a very comprehensive, giving a picture about the status and treatment of, investment law in India. Probably we will have an opportunity to kind of, engage with you more. Maybe the fellows will have more opportunity to engage with you more. But let me now take the opportunity to introduce our second panelist, Kshama Lohia. Kshama is currently associated with Desai Associates. Kshama specializes in international commercial and investment treaty arbitration, litigation, and pre-litigation strategies. She has acted as counsel in various proceedings, including institutional and ad hoc arbitrations and litigations in Indian court and tribunals. She has special focus on advocacy and cross-examination of witness. She has advised on disputes and issues arising in a range of industries, including energy, mining, infrastructure, construction, production. I believe almost all areas, probably she have covered almost all areas, including media, entertainment, aviation, advertising, etc. Kshama holds an LLM in international commercial law from King's College London and has studied negotiation and dispute resolution at Harvard Business School. Prior to her LLM, she was practicing in the chamber of the then Advocate Justice Ganga Purwala in the High Court of Mumbai. Welcome, and please take please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Babu. I'm extremely grateful to Daksha Fellowship for this kind invitation, and I'm delighted to be on this panel. It's also humbling to be on this panel with Prabhash, who was a guest tutor on international investment law at King's College London at the time I was doing my LLM, which was a decade ago. So, Mr. Babu, forgive me if you find me returning to my college days and asking questions to Prabhash. Prabhash gave a very helpful outline on the causes and reasons for India entering into the model BIT of 2016. I'm going to focus on the settlement of disputes provision in the model BIT, which is a unique provision and also the most criticized. Now, I have thoroughly analyzed the 2016 model BIT in our Nishit Desai Associates paper on international investment arbitration in India, but I will focus on key points in relation to the settlement of disputes clause today. And I will also then deal with the different models of dispute resolution that India has adopted in its new BITs after signing the model BIT of 2016 or after introducing the model BIT of 2016. Now, why is the settlement of disputes clause so important for a discussion today? Access to dispute resolution mechanisms is a critical guarantee under BITs. It provides direct access to foreign investors against state measures that violate BIT provisions. So, therefore, it is essential that this access is not unusually difficult or burdensome for either party. But well, BITs are a product of party agreement. So ease or burden of provisions really depends on negotiating powers and skills of parties agreeing to such clauses under BITs. Now, Mr. Babu mentioned, and Prabhash also mentioned, that the first substantive treaty arbitration against India was in 2011 when a commercial arbitration award in favor of the Australian company White Industries languished in Indian courts for enforcement for nearly 9 years. Now, this resulted in the most unique investment treaty claim by White Industries against India for breach of treaty guarantee to provide effective means to assert claims, imported by way of a most favored nation treatment clause into the India-Australia BIT from the India-UK BIT, India-Kuwait BIT, I'm sorry. Now, White Industries was successful. India was directed to pay approximately $4 million in damages and legal costs. And Prabhash also touched on how between 2011 and 2015, investors filed several BIT cases against India. So if you look at White Industries, essentially delays in enforcement of a commercial award under the Indian judicial system resulted in a BIT claim. The DR clause or the dispute resolution clause in our model BIT is perhaps a reaction to this particular BIT claim. It is probably a means to expressly provide a long period of exhaustion of local remedies in Indian courts or administrative bodies before the investor can validly initiate arbitration. So, what is the framework of the dispute resolution clause in the 2016 model BIT? I'll just briefly touch on this. Chapter 4 of the model BIT deals with settlement of disputes provisions. It is perhaps the longest chapter in our BIT and in any BIT. It has about 18 articles. I'm going to focus on one article which deals with conditions precedent to submission of claim to arbitration. So arbitration does remain a long stop under our model BIT, but it's the long stop in the truest sense of the term. I'll come to sequence of steps in a bit, but effectively, an investor can initiate arbitration if the model BIT is adopted. At the earliest, only after 5 years and 9 months from when the investor first acquired knowledge of the investment impacting state measure and knowledge of the loss or damage suffered consequent to such measure. So the model BIT provides a sequence that the investor has to follow in order to ultimately reach a mechanism of invoking arbitration. Now, the first point in this sequence is to determine the time when the investor first acquires or should have acquired knowledge of the measure in question and resulting loss or damage to the investment. Now, within 1 year from this first point, the investor must submit its claim to domestic courts or administrative bodies in India. The next step is to exhaust local remedies for at least 5 years. And if no resolution is reached, then further steps towards arbitration can be taken, which I will deal with later. But at this point, the only respite to an investor from the exhaustion of local remedies rule of 5 years is to demonstrate that there are no available domestic legal remedies capable of reasonably providing any relief against state measure. Now, this is a situation that is extremely tough to demonstrate, a situation where the investor has to demonstrate that I do not have any legal remedies which can resolve my problem and provide a relief in a particular situation in Indian courts and administrative bodies, and hence I am bypassing the exhaustion of local remedies rule and invoking arbitration under a BIT. So let's go back to the stage of where the investor is required to exhaust local remedies for 5 years. After this 5 years, our model BIT provides that if no resolution is reached in Indian courts or our administrative bodies, then the investor can issue a notice of dispute to the state. And for at least 6 months, both parties must use best efforts to amicably resolve the dispute, either through consultations, negotiations, or third party procedures like mediation. If these efforts fail in 6 months, then the investor can initiate arbitration. Now, before that, even before initiating arbitration, the investor must ensure three conditions. One, that 6 years have not passed from the first point when the investor acquired knowledge of the state measure and knowledge of its loss arising from the state measure. Second is 12 months have not passed, more than 12 months have not passed since conclusion of domestic proceedings in Indian courts or administrative bodies. And third is at least 90 days before starting arbitration, a notice of intention to submit the claim to arbitration must be given by the investor to the state. So, what are the difficulties in this framework apart from just being a long sequence of steps? Firstly, as I see it, the starting point from where limitation will run, the point where investor acquired knowledge of the state measure or should have acquired knowledge, that itself is quite uncertain. Coupled with a requirement that the investor should have acquired knowledge of loss caused to the investment. Now, these are two cumulative requirements, to determine one point in time from which limitation will start running. And this is obviously open to ambiguities. There will be disputes on computing the limitation period, trying to determine this very first point from where limitation will run. And then this is further aggravated by the next difficulty, which is what happens after an investor exhausts local remedies for 5 years. There is a further 9 months before the investor can initiate arbitration. So even if the investor is taking every step diligently and in a timely manner, the investor should be in a position to initiate arbitration after 5 years and 9 months. However, the limitation to commence arbitration, according to our model BIT, stops at 6 years from the date when the investor acquired knowledge of the state measure, which was the first point to determine limitation. So if you see, post expiry of this 6-year period, the investor is barred from submitting the claim to arbitration. Effectively, there is a margin of just 3 months for the investor to successfully submit its claim. Any delay here or there could bar the recourse to arbitration. So, as I conclude in my paper, there are several hurdles that the foreign investor will need to cross to have access to international arbitration, which is a critical guarantee under BITs, as I mentioned earlier. Now, drawing from White Industries, where the award was lying in Indian court system for 9 years, we have expressly included a 5-year period for exhaustion of local remedies in our BIT. But what we need to acknowledge is that we are a country where the rate of filing of cases is far greater and faster than the rate of disposal of cases. So this is why we have a backlog of cases. And why do we want to add investor-state disputes to the court's caseload? If we believe that it is in fact better for our courts to first assess the state measure. Then it is more advisable to provide for a reasonable time period for exhaustion of these local remedies, which is, which can range from 18 months to 2 years. And of course, the starting point, which is, as I mentioned, which is quite uncertain in our model BIT to determine. This first point can generally be the point when the dispute arose between the parties, rather than when the investor acquired knowledge and when the loss was suffered by the investor. So what is required under our model BIT, especially with relation to the settlement of disputes clause, uh, is a need to move from clutter to clarity. We have been bitten by treaty disputes, but the solution is not to bite back. Where dispute resolution rests on the foundation of party agreement, I think we need to create models that are mutually agreeable. And this brings me to my next point on what has happened after we have introduced the model BIT in 2016. Prabhash mentioned that an odd four new BITs only have been entered into by India. But what is the development in relation to the dispute resolution clauses in these new BITs? So, as a first step towards implementation of renewed investor state regime in 2016, India executed a joint interpretative note with Bangladesh in October 2017. Now, their parties attempted to emulate provisions of the 2016 India Model BIT into the notes, but the notes on dispute resolution clause did not include the conditions precedent to submitting to arbitration. So that remained as it was under the original India-Bangladesh BIT with a few modifications, but not including these sequence of steps that an investor is required to take. The next was in September 2018 when Belarus became the first country to execute a new BIT with India. Now, this BIT was predominantly based on our 2016 model BIT, including the dispute resolution clause. However, while the rigors of the local remedies clause were kept intact, which is 5 years, investors in the India-Belarus BIT have been provided with a limitation period of 2 years instead of one to file a claim before domestic courts. And subsequently, the limitation period to proceed with arbitration has been increased to 7 years. That leaves us with just two more new BITs. One was executed in October 2018, not a BIT, but a joint interpretative declaration with Colombia, which is almost identical to the India-Bangladesh joint interpretative notes, with an added provision on denial of benefits. But close on the heels of Belarus in December 2018, Taipei Cultural and Economic Center in India signed a BIT with the India Taipei Association in Taipei. Now, being similar to the 2016 model BIT in majority aspects, the dispute resolution clause in this BIT provides a limitation period of 1 year, 6 months instead of 1 year to the investor to file its claim before relevant domestic courts. And additionally, a period of exhaustion of local remedies of only 4 years instead of 5 years. But the last one, which is the most recent, is the BIT between India and Brazil, which actually goes on the model introduced by Brazil, which is a cooperation and investment facilitation model. And I will not get into the details of this model. It can be seen in the India-Brazil BIT. But what the India-Brazil BIT provides is for state-to-state dispute settlement and completely removes investor-state dispute settlement. So these are the developments after the introduction of the 2016 India Model BIT in relation to new BITs that have been entered into by India. Back to you, Professor Babu.
Thank you, Shama, for detailed explanation on one of the key aspect of the model BIT. But before, I mean, I kind of you can finish off your public presentation and call the third panelist. Just a clarification, because people also would like to know, in terms of model BITs, one of the key aspect is how, in terms of the tax treatment, right? Tax exemption, right? Usually, the sovereign space, they want to retain, most of the states, sovereign states want to retain that space. How is it kind of dealt with, given the Vodafone case and etc.? How is it dealt with in the new model treaty? Briefly, again, we have limited time, so briefly, yes. Thank you.
I'll make it quick. We have all absolutely read about Government of India's stand on Sovereign Taxation Authority of India that cannot be challenged under a BIT. And then we have seen what happened in Vodafone and Ken Awards. So at the outset, let's make it clear. BITs are about testing sovereign powers of a state on the pedestal of international law. Taxation authority falls under the broad bucket of sovereign powers of a state. Yet, I acknowledge that taxation powers do hold a special place in a state's sovereign powers basket because it impacts social, economic, political fabric of a country. But to this end, what can be excluded from BITs is sovereign decision-making authority to tax transactions, which was also held by the Ken Tribunal. Whether or not a transaction is taxable, how will it be taxed, that can be left to the sole domain of a state. But using a tax measure as an escape route or as a route to target, discriminate, or arbitrarily impose liability on foreign investors, this can certainly be tested under international law, under a BIT. Prabhash mentioned, bad regulatory conduct. That is what can be tested under a BIT. So not the decision to tax, but the manner of imposing that tax can be tested. And to this end, in the 2016 model BIT, again as a reaction to Vodafone and Ken cases which were initiated in 2012 and 2014, our model BIT states that any law or measure regarding taxation, including measures to enforce taxation obligations, will be exempted from the treaty. But goes a step further and says that where the state in which investment is made decides that the conduct alleged to be a breach of its obligations under this treaty is taxation subject, such decision of the state, whether it's before or after initiating arbitration proceedings, shall not be justiciable, and it shall not be open for an arbitral tribunal to review such decision. Now, I believe this clause is tremendously broad and arbitrary, and if I dare say, unbridled powers are vested in the hands of a sovereign regarding taxation through this clause. So, having said that, it will be interesting to see if effects of taxation measures or manner of adoption of taxation would continue to be amenable to jurisdiction of a treaty tribunal. Back to you, Professor Babu.
Thank you very much. As Prabhash rightly pointed out, the pendulum has swung from one side to the other, right? So, may I take this opportunity to call the third panelist for the session, Dr. Rishabh Gupta. Rishabh is a partner at Amarchand Mangaladas, one of India's largest full-service law firm. He currently leads the arbitration practice in Mumbai. His specialization includes international arbitration, public international law, bribery-related investigations, etc. Rishabh is qualified to practice not just in India, but also in US and UK. And he has been practicing in several law firms across in London and New York. Rishabh also has very strong academic interest. He regularly publishes in leading journals and give lectures, seminar at university around the world. He completed his doctorate in the field of international economic law, one of the very interesting area, political risk insurance, from Oxford University on a Rhodes Scholarship. He would be, I believe, touching upon one of very interesting topic, which is, do we even need BIT to attract investment, right? So, Rishabh, please go ahead. Thank you.
Right. Thanks. Thank you. Am I even audible?
Yes, yes.
I am, right? Okay, sorry. I just have a very odd setup here. Hi, everyone, and thank you, Professor Babu. I can barely see anyone, but I just wanted to get a sense before I start from you, Professor Babu. The people who are listening to us, are they, what background do they have? Are they lawyers by training or?
Mahesh, can you please?
We have two sets of listeners. One is our fellows who are lawyers by training. Many of them have practiced for some time. Many others have done LLM. Some of them are fresh out of college. And then we also have a bunch of other attendees since it's in a webinar format. So those are registrations from outside of the Sai University. And I'm guessing most of them would be lawyers.
Got it. Thank you. No, that's awesome. I just wanted to ask that question because I wanted to see how to pitch this. I don't really have any sort of very fixed sort of notes or topic in my mind to discuss. What I actually wanted to do, as you rightly pointed out, Professor Babu, is to just sort of question whether we need any of this at all. And to be able to question that, of course, you need to understand why it exists in the first place. And you know what Prabhash gave you very helpfully was sort of, you know, the narrative as to how it came about. But I think there's a question behind that as well, right? That fine, it has come about and it has come about in a certain way, but is it even required? And what sort of problem is it trying to solve? And I think since, you know, not everyone here who's listening to this would have had any experience of how these BITs come into play, I thought it would be useful to share a couple of examples as a starting point to see, you know, how investors think about them and how we think about them in practice, and then take it forward from there. So I'll just share two examples to start with from my own practice, very recent examples of ongoing cases. One sort of targeted towards India and one targeted outside of India. And that will give you a very clear sense of how this comes into play. And then we can ask ourselves as to whether this is required at all. So both are publicly known cases. I can talk about them. So one case is you've got a Korean investor who sort of built a power plant project, a gas-fired power plant project in Maharashtra. And of course, if it's a gas-fired power plant project, then the very basis on which it has been set up, obviously, is that there'll be a continuous supply of gas. If you don't have a continuous supply of natural gas, you can't run the power plant. And second, you need an offtake agreement because the power that you generate has to be sold to someone on the grid. So you need the state to support that as well. So effectively, when you build a power plant project of that sort, there are two guarantees, broadly speaking, that you're getting from the state. One, that they'll give you the natural gas on the basis of which you'll run the power plant project. And the second is that they'll ultimately buy your power, right? Now, we all know that the power plants generally across the country have had massive problems, which also led to that directive by the RBI to take them all to insolvency, which ultimately went up to the Supreme Court. But basically, in terms of my client, at least, the Korean company, because of the non-availability of natural gas and because of the glut in the market, due to which there's no need for additional power supply, they have been stranded at both ends. They can't run the power plant because they don't have the gas, and there's no one to buy their power either. Now, what do you do if you're a foreign investor in that position? And I think you should ask that question, not just from the perspective of a foreign investor. You should ask yourself, what do you do if you're an Indian investor in that position? So one example is my client, the Korean company. The other example is, let's say you're Tata's or Adani, and they are in that position as well because they're in the power sector as well. What do they do? Now, what would Tata's and Adani's do? They have a few options, right? One, they could lobby the government, right? Use their connections with the various ministries to try and push their agenda. And I don't mean it in a wrong way. I mean it in this sort of very positive interaction with the government to explain to them where their problems are. If that doesn't lead to anything, they could try their judicial remedies. Now, what would be those judicial remedies? The most obvious one that we all think about is the writ petition route. So you file a writ because there's state actions involved and you challenge various activities or actions which you think infringe upon your guaranteed rights. That's the second thing they would do. The third thing could be that to the extent that they have contractual agreements with anyone on the opposite side, the state actors, they would exercise their contractual remedies. So if it provides for litigation in domestic courts or arbitration, whatever, they'll do that. Broadly speaking, those are the three things they would do. Now, all those three things theoretically are available to the foreign investor as well. The foreign investor can also lobby the government to the extent they have connections or they have an approach. They could also go for judicial review in the form of writ petitions. And they could also exercise their contractual rights under the various agreements that may be at play. What they also have is what we are discussing today, the fourth remedy, which is that they could exercise their rights under bilateral investment treaties to sue the government directly in international arbitration, which the Indian investor doesn't have. So effectively, whenever you think about this, you have to think about it at a relative level, that what is it that the investor is getting, which is more than what is otherwise available to them. And what that additional bit is, that they have that, in my hypothetical, the fourth right. Yeah, they could do any of what Tatas and Adanis can do, plus they can also sue the government in international arbitration. Yeah. Now, that's the additional right from an investor's perspective. What is it that the state, i.e. the government of India, is getting in this bargain, right? Because whenever you give something, you should obviously expect something back as well, right? So if the state is giving that additional right to the investor, it has to ask itself, why should I give it? And if I'm giving it, what should I get in return for it? Now, what it's getting, in theory, is the promise of future investments, not promise in the way of a contractually enforceable promise, but more in the sense of a metaphorical or a sort of, expected promise that you will get further investments in the future, that there will be an impact of these BITs such that more companies, in this case from Korea, would invest in India. So the underlying assumption being that my client, for example, may not have come into India had there not been this BIT, or had it come into India without the BIT, it would have been more wary of making the kind of investments that it made. It might have expected a higher profit premiums and so on and so forth. So that's what technically the state gets. And that's effectively your quid pro quo. The investor gets that additional right, which the domestic guys don't have. And the state gets the possibility or the expectation of future investments. Now, all of you should pause there for a second as well. And I don't know if the audience has any economic students or economists amongst them. But there is a question that you should ask yourself here as well, is that, do I really care for that foreign investment? The economist amongst you would know that there's a lot of literature out there which talks about whether or not FDI, which, if you were to believe the newspapers and sort of the general propaganda, is beautiful, right? We all want foreign direct investment. It helps with balance of payments. It increases employment and so on and so forth. But those who would have studied this area would know that actually there are lots of downsides to FDI as well, right? So if you're one of them who says that, look, FDI is not necessarily any better than local investment, and in fact, in some cases, it might be worse, then you question the existence of the BITs altogether. Because the underlying premise on which it exists, which is that it'll increase FDI, if you're not in favor of increasing FDI, then this is out, right? You should not do this. And that's an important point, because you have to ask that question. Yeah, you might come to the conclusion that FDI is good for me, I want to promote it, therefore I want to enter into these BITs. And that therefore bit I'll come to later. But ask that question. Yeah, the policymakers among you, or those who aspire to be policymakers, ask that question. Now, let's reverse this now. So I'll give you another example of a case study. Indian investor goes into Macedonia, yeah, and invests into the mining sector there. Right, so buys an interest in copper mines, zinc mines, and so on and so forth. And what happens over time is that the laws change in such a way that the outstanding debts that the company has lead to a very sort of aggressive action by the local government to wind up the company and ultimately sell it off or wind up the assets, which are the company with its assets, which are the mines, and thereafter sell them at a massive discount to a competitor from Bulgaria. Yeah. And basically, we are in a position where our interest in mines may be worth about $250 million, but they're sold off in an auction to the Bulgarian company for $5 million. And even that $5 million doesn't come to me because technically, according to the state, there are creditors. So the money goes to the creditors and I'm suddenly sort of left with no assets at all. Now, at least in our case, that was unlawful. Yeah. Now, what rights do I have? You ask the same question that the Korean company asks. The rights are the same, right? You could lobby the Macedonian government. You could move for judicial review. Writ petition is an Indian construct, but the basic international construct is judicial review. So you move for judicial review. You exercise your contractual rights. And fourth is the investment treaty, because India has a BIT with Macedonia. Now, when we were looking at that, we didn't have any connections with the government, so we thought lobbying is useless. We were and are still in the local courts in Macedonia. But that hasn't really led to any benefit. And we think that it wouldn't because the courts are not neutral, at least on our case. I mean, I'm not making any allegations, but at least to us, it seems that they're not neutral on this. So therefore, to us, BIT seems like an attractive proposition, right? Now, if you now put yourself, again, for the policymakers amongst you and those who might be interested in it, you ask yourself a question that if I want to give further protections to my Indian companies who are going abroad, yeah, especially to countries where the political risk is high. So, if you're going to Switzerland and you're going to the United States or the UK, the systems are much more transparent, much more certain, so you don't care that much. But if you're going to Latin America, parts of Africa, parts of Eastern Europe, you're concerned, right? So you ask yourself the question as a minister in the government or as a civil servant, that what more protections can I give to my Indian companies or Indian investors when they go abroad, right? And this might be one of them. But remember that ultimately BITs are reciprocal, at least the way they're constructed at the moment. So if I give protections to my companies going abroad, I have to give similar protections to investors from those countries coming into India. Yeah, there's no sort of one-way street, at least in the way it's constructed at the moment. So that's the balancing act you do, right? As a government officer, as a policymaker, you ask yourself some very basic fundamental questions. Do I care for foreign direct investment? If the answer is no, this is useless. If the answer is yes, then you ask yourself, how do I promote foreign direct investment? There are 100 different ways you can promote it, and you can take it from me that BITs would be very low on that list. If you genuinely want to promote foreign direct investment, you need to create the right infrastructure. You need to create certainty in the judicial system. You need to do lots of other things, liberalize your economy and so on. But let's say BIT is on that list. So you say yourself that, okay, fine, I want to sort of enter into BITs because I believe that will help promote foreign direct investment. Whether it will actually help promote foreign direct investment is an empirical question, right? You can't just say it because you feel that that's the right answer. You got to test it. And I'll come to that sort of testing bit a little bit. So that's the second question. First question is, do I care for FDI? Second, if I want to promote FDI, do I think BITs would help me there? And the third question you ask yourself is, keep all of that aside. I am not just a recipient of foreign direct investment. I'm also an exporter of foreign direct investment. I have companies like Tata's and Adani's and so on and so forth who are investing abroad as well. So I want to protect them as well, because I don't want them to be in a position where they get screwed because of changes in law in the local economy. Just to give you a couple of examples, which are very real, aside from the Macedonian one I mentioned. A few years ago, Venezuela introduced price control provisions, because of which what they basically said is that you can't take foreign currency out of Venezuela. I don't know how many of you know this, but in the Indian pharma industry, the generic industry, is the largest provider of medicines in Latin America. So your companies like Dr. Reddy's Labs and Glenmark's and so on and so forth have huge exposure to Latin America, including to Venezuela. Now, they lost hundreds of millions of dollars because of these currency control restrictions. And as someone who cares to promote these companies and give them the confidence to go abroad, you ask yourself the question, what can I do, right? And if you think BITs is an answer, then you think about that. So that's your third question. That first is, do I care for FDI? And if so, how do I promote it? And do BITs help? And the third question you ask yourself is, fine, but I also want to export capital because that's helpful for my country's growth. And therefore, I want to give Indian investors going abroad the protections, the confidence to be able to do it. And there might lie the answer as to why you want BITs, which actually is the reason why BITs came into existence in the first place, because they were all pushed by countries like the US or countries in Western Europe, which are not that bothered about incoming FDI. They're bothered about outgoing FDI, and they want to give protections to their foreign investors or their investors who are going abroad. So same way we should think about it as well. Now, with that sort of laid out, I thought I'll spend just a few minutes and then I'll stop, because I think it's better to discuss some of these things through Q&A than a long speech from me. The second question I said that, so you've gotten over the hurdle that you want FDI, but you're asking yourself, how do I promote FDI? And do BITs help? Now, it is this second question which has been empirically tested quite a lot. There have been loads of studies done over the last 15, 20 years, mostly quantitative studies, which ask a very simple question. What is the correlation between BITs and FDI? And they go about it in different ways. They apply regression analysis. They look at different data sets. Some are focused on certain jurisdictions. Some are focused on broader regions. Some are macro in the sense that they're looking at it at a global level, and so on and so forth. And many of these have been sort of sponsored by leading international institutions like the World Bank or UNCTAD and so on and so forth, or they have been sponsored by universities. But unfortunately, none of them have really reached any consensus. So there are studies which show there's a positive correlation. In other words, if you sign on to a BIT, over time, you can expect more FDI coming in. There are those which say there's no correlation at all. So, they exist in different planes. It doesn't matter. And there are surprisingly a couple of studies which actually show a negative correlation. I've never really understood how that works, but there are a couple of studies which even show that. Now, if you just pause there for a second, and you're someone who's interested in numbers, and you're someone who's interested in knowing empirical evidence for doing something, you ask yourself, why the hell am I signing on to these BITs at all then? Because if there is no empirical evidence, at least at the quantitative level, then why am I exposing myself to additional claims? Why should I not, in my two cases that I mentioned, say to the foreign investor that, look, guys, it's not that if things go bad, you have no other rights. You have the same rights that my local guys also have. And, you do it on the same basis. But then there is another way to test it, which is to sort of speak to people, do it in the more traditional way, send out surveys and stuff like that. Now, I did some of that, and the findings, again, were not necessarily that sort of positive to the extent that you want to advocate for BITs. Most of the people who participated in the survey said that they did not know about BITs. Only 18% of those who participated said that they knew about BITs. Among them, majority said that they knew about BITs, but didn't know them that well. 10% said that they check PITs. So 10% of the corporations said that they check PITs before making investments in India, which is very low. None of them, not even one respondent to the survey, said that they had ever declined making an investment on the basis that there was no PIT. Now, that's also quite damning, right? Because if you think it's an important factor, then you sort of take that into account. That said, there was quite a large number of people who felt that it was an important indicator in assessing whether the political risk in India is high or low. And it was one of the tools in their armory that they think about in terms of mitigating political risk. And because we're on the topic of the model BIT, most of them had never heard of the model BIT, which I don't find surprising. Why would they read about the model BIT when it's not an enforceable agreement at all? There's one more thing I should mention here, and then I'll stop. See, when you think about mitigating political risk, BIT is, of course, one of them, but there are lots of other tools available to you. And this goes back to my sort of original PhD thesis. To my mind, the most logical way of mitigating political risk, so mitigating the kind of problems that my Korean client has faced, for example, right, where political decisions were made, regulatory environment changed, and their investments were adversely impacted because suddenly the government decided that natural gas should not be made available for private power plants. They should be made available to the fertilizer industry. Yeah, that's a pure political decision, which screws up the client, right? Or there's a change in the system such that the government wants to move towards renewable power production, such that they don't want power coming out of a gas-fired power plant. Yeah, that's again a sort of a change in the political regulatory landscape. Now, I understand you want to sort of promote foreign direct investment. I also understand that the investors want that certainty, such that if everything goes down the tube, you got to sort of be able to have some way out of it, to be able to recoup your investment to some extent. One answer to all of this, I've always felt, is to think more robustly about political risk insurance. Because see, ultimately, if you put yourself in the shoes of a normal commercial business, you always take the risk that your business might go down the tube, right? So you take the risk, for example, you have a go down and you have all your raw materials kept there. You take a risk that it might burn down by fire, right? Or that you have a stupid neighbor who will sort of do something odd in the go down next to it, and as a result, your place will fall down, or that there'll be a flood or a cyclone, and so on and so forth. Now, what do you do for that? You take an insurance, right? And you pay a premium. So you take an insurance, you pay a premium, and so on and so forth. Now, in the same way as you can take an insurance to protect against risk of fire, risk of floods, and so on and so forth, you can take an insurance to protect against political risk also. Those insurance, that insurance is available both from private players and public players, government players, not so easily available in the Indian context, but very easily available, at least in more sort of advanced economies in North America and Western Europe, and also in countries like Japan. Now, what that does is it takes away the onus from the state providing you with protection. So if the same kind of issues happen, which happened to Vodafone or Kane, as Shama was talking about, or happens to sort of, the example of the client I gave you, you don't go running, looking for a BIT and suing the government and saying that, look, you, the government, are responsible for that regulatory change, so give me $5 billion in compensation. You go to the insurance provider, right? And for that insurance, you pay a premium because BIT protections are coming for free. So you pay a premium, right? You pay 3%, 4%, whatever it might be, depending on the risk profile. And I think that's something which one should explore more. So again, to those among you who aspire not to do doctrinal law like sort of I do, but aspire to do more sort of interesting stuff, policy making, thinking about whether these things should be there at all. I think ask yourself questions that, do I care for foreign direct investment? If I care for foreign direct investment, how do I promote it? And do BITs genuinely help promote it? Even if I care for foreign direct investment, and I think BITs can play a role in promoting foreign direct investment, is there a better tool out there which balances the protections that a foreign investor wants, but at the same time ensures that the interests of the state are protected? And fourth, ask yourself the question that it's not just a one-way street. I also want to protect my Indian companies who are going abroad. So what can I do for them? I think that's really it. I can stop there, Professor Babu.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Rishabh, for giving an alternative perspective on the deliberations. So what we will now do is that we will request, there is a small presentation by Daksha Fellow group, and probably if Manish correct me, Mahesh correct me if I'm wrong, 15 minutes or so. And afterwards, we will open it for question answer session. My request to anyone who wishes to have questions is that please take this opportunity also to write down your questions and which panelist you would like to ask these questions, so that they are also prepared to respond immediately the presentation is over, right? So may I request the Diksha fellows to kind of make their presentation. Thank you.
A very good afternoon to the panelists. Thank you so much for such an insightful discussion. My name is Tushar Bahel, and it is a great pleasure for me and my teammates, Mridul, Ritvik, and Sanjay, to participate in this panel and also to welcome you to this beautiful event. The model PIT, as we see, reflects a muddled approach with more exceptions to protections than protections themselves, as I would rephrase. To understand the model BIT of 2016, which was essentially a knee-jerk to the White Industries case, we are going to get into a two-step inquiry, where I, along with Mridul, we will delve into the substantive treaty protections in the model BIT 2016, and Sanjay and Ritvik will tackle the challenges associated with the enforcement of investment arbitral awards. Coming to the first element of the substantive treaty protections, which is the fair and equitable treatment standard. The model PIT completely omits the fair and equitable treatment standard, which is by principle very strongly attached to the genesis of a bilateral investment treaty. The standard has been replaced by treatment of investments. While this may be because the ISDS tribunals interpret the standard way too broadly, but by specifically not including legitimate expectations, which is the soul of the fair and equitable treatment, as a part of the international minimum standard which the BIT refers to, India has managed to tilt the scale in favor of the host state's regulatory power. It is also pertinent to note in this article 3.1 of the model BIT that the omission of manifest arbitrariness, manifest arbitrariness as we understand is a willful disregard to the due process of law. And is also, it's a smart move according to me, because since it is also a smart move since foreign investors who are bringing a challenge to the host state's regulatory conduct would then have to refer to the fundamental breach of due process under Article 3.1, meaning that the host state can only be held liable only if the violation reaches a certain stage of extremicity and ferocity and not otherwise, which leaves it to a high arbitral discretion according to me. Coming to the second element, which is the full protection and security aspect. So while many tribunals have interpreted the FPS standard to mean and include all kinds of protection, which include physical security, as well as in the same way restricting itself to including investments and including all other kinds of protection, which includes physical protection to foreign investments. Article 3.2 of the model BIT also works in a similar fashion, where it restricts itself to physical security and not just to any other protections or obligations, such as maintaining a stable or legal commercial or a business environment. This is a very clear picture on the part of India's model BIT. And this certainly curbs arbitral discretion, according to me, and ensures that an obligation on the host state to provide physical security to foreign investments, something which was not present in the draft BIT, which was existent earlier. This provision also mandates that the tribunal to determine if local remedies have been pursued to, something as we commonly known as the exhaustion of local remedies principle. This has to be claimed before claiming under the provision, which in fact stems from the trend of the recent treaty claims and as well as the arbitral practice, where the full protection and security standard has been in fact broadly interpreted by the tribunals, which is in a good way to avoid arbitral discretion and reconcile investment protection with the host state's right to regulate. Coming to the third point, expropriation. Article 5, an expropriation, as we understand, is where a state is prohibited from taking privately owned property of a foreign investor directly or indirectly made for a public purpose and with due and adequate compensation. Now, as we understand from the Article 5, expropriation in terms of the model BIT, direct expropriation can be through nationalization, a formal transfer of title, or an outright seizure. Indirect expropriation, within the meaning of Article 5.3b, there have been certain factors enlisted which associate itself to indirect expropriation. These range from a number of factors which include economic impact, duration of measure, character of an investment, which includes the object and intent, and factors which associate there have been whether there has been a breach of a prior written commitment, etc. and etc. This is very vague according to me, and this raises certain questions which we really need to ponder upon. For example, how do we actually determine indirect expropriation? How do we measure and balance and weigh all these factors which have been listed? Secondly, how do we actually assess substantial deprivation, which is the crucial element of the standard of expropriation? In addition to this tribunal's second-guessing regulatory measures, the model BIT, in addition, has affirmed its stand that any measure by a judicial body aiming to protect public interest will lie outside the purview of expropriation, which essentially means that it will not amount to expropriation as long as a measure is non-discriminatory in nature and which serves public purpose, which clearly shows a lack of compromise with protection of foreign investments and a lack of standard to actually check regulatory overreach. Now, Mridul is going to be talking about the MFN treatment as well as the other exceptions in the model BIT.
Thank you, Tushar. So I'll deal with the most favored nation treatment. So this particular model BIT excludes the MFN clause. It does not have an MFN clause. Now, what will be the probable reasons behind that? So the government of India did not come up with any explanation as to why the MFN clause was deleted. So one of the probable reasons could be that it wanted to restrict the investors from borrowing a favorable clause from a different BIT. As Ms. Shama alluded to earlier, whereby she quoted an example of White Industries, whereby a White Industry borrowed a favorable clause from India Kuwait BIT. Now, what MFN basically means, it's not as it sounds. It's a misnomer. When a MFN clause is there in a treaty, it does not say that particular country will get a favorable treatment, but it actually says if another country is getting a favorable treatment, same treatment will be extended to the primary BIT. So this is there. Now, what will be the risk to the investment? Now, risk can be posed in two ways. First, India can give preferential treatment to a foreign investor under BIT without providing the same treatment to another foreign investor. Second, India can provide preferential treatment in application to domestic measures. So these are the two reasons how the risk is there. Now, as we can assess, this particular deletion can be said to be just the writings on the walls. So what happened in 2014 during the World Economic Forum? India in official statement said that what MFN does is It disturbs the various strategic, diplomatic, and political reasons behind negotiating bilateral treaties. So it, throws off the delicate balance that India wants to establish with different countries, and it wants to have a different BIT with every different country. Now, coming to the other exceptions. Now, the first thing that catches everyone's eye is the taxation. Now, taxation. Uh, we briefly touched upon the two cases, the Vodafone and the Kane bilateral arbitration. What happened there was India retrospectively amended the taxation legislation. Now, India yet again puts taxation under the exception, whereby any remedy cannot be claimed by an investor. It poses two questions. One, whether India will again do something like it did when it amended the taxation legislation retrospectively. Now, I want to relate it to rule of law. Now, what rule of law says, as per Lon Fuller, he said one of the principles that he laid down was a legislation should not be retrospectively applicable. According to him, if a legislation is retrospectively applied, the country or the state is not a rule of law state at all. Coming to compulsory licensing. Now, with its relevance in the COVID-19 era. Now, during COVID-19, first I'll highlight India already has a compulsory licensing regime, but due to COVID, what happened? Multiple new countries are coming up with their a set of compulsory licensing regime. Some of the examples can be Ecuador, Chile, Israel, and Germany. Now, this compulsory licensing, which has been kept under exemption, it can be considered to be futile. Why do I say so? Because the investor again has the power before the arbitral tribunal to argue that this particular compulsory license has not been issued as per the TRIPS regulation. So it does not decrease the arbitral discretion. The arbitral discretion is still there to decide whether it was in consonance with TRIPS or not. Now, my other members will take you through the enforcement challenges.
I hope I'm audible. Okay. So, like Tushar mentioned, the legal scenario surrounding BITs in India is muddled, and a significant cause for this is the lack of an enforcement mechanism in place for arbitral awards when it comes to BIT. So, what Ritwik and I will do is we will try to analyze 3 judicial decisions pertaining to BIT disputes, certain aspects of them which relate to how these disputes have been looked at by Indian courts. So the first case we will look at is the Port of Kolkata versus LDA, where this was the first instance wherein any court in India examined BIT arbitration itself. So we are going to highlight the fact that all the 3 cases that we're going to look at have looked at the applicability of Arbitration and Conciliation Act 1996 to international investment arbitration differently. So the Kolkata High Court looked at the applicability of the Arbitration and Conciliation Act in a way that they just presumed it to be applicable without delving into the details as to why the act is applicable. Whereas in the cases of Vodafone and Khaitan, the Delhi High Court looked at the applicability of the Arbitration and Conciliation Act and said that it is not applicable to BIT. So now if you were to apply the Kolkata High Court's approach of presumed applicability of the Arbitration and Conciliation Act to BITs, then both Part 1 and Part 2 of the Act would be applicable to BITs itself, both in domestic as well as foreign jurisdictions. But at the same time, what the Delhi High Court has done is that the Delhi High Court has refused to take precedent to count the Calcutta High Court judgment as precedents, because they have stated that the Calcutta High Court They have stated that the Calcutta High Court did not look into any issues pertaining to whether the act would be applicable, and therefore they refused precedence. So now I will move on to another important issue when it comes to the applicability of the Act, ANC Act to BITs, and what the Delhi High Court said in the matter, where they said that there is the element of commerciality is lacking in a BIT arbitration. The court reasoned that the BIT arbitration disputes are fundamentally different from commercial disputes because the cause of action in BIT disputes is not commercial, but based on state guarantees and treaty obligations. So, an important question to be raised here is whether in a BIT the fundamental cause of action is whether the dispute is commercial in nature. So an important question here would be that if a BIT is between a host state and a foreign investor, and there is a supply agreement, does the host state, does it count as a commercial dispute because inherently the cause of action is not commercial, but the legal relationship between the two parties is commercial? So that is an important question to be raised here, which does not have finality in any court of law. And now, so to sum up, the Kolkata and Delhi High Court differed in their views towards the applicability of the Arbitration and Conciliation Act towards BIT disputes, and therefore the present legal position in India is muddled. And now I will turn it over to Ritwik in order to examine whether there is some sort of solution for this.
Hello, I hope I'm audible. Yeah, so like Sanjay pointed out that there is ambiguity around the applicable law, and the Calcutta High Court followed the presumed application of the application of the Arbitration and Conciliation Act 1996, whereas the Delhi High Court differed from the Calcutta High Court and said that the Arbitration and Conciliation Act is not applicable to such disputes because essentially it is not BIT arbitrations are not commercial in nature. Now this creates problems in terms of enforcement because India has certain reservations under the New York Convention. One of them is that it will only enforce awards which are commercial in nature. Now this creates a problem because if the Delhi High Court considers that there is no commercial nature when it comes to BIT arbitrations, then there might be some difficulty in terms of enforcement. At the outset, it is important to point out that the question of enforcement in terms of BIT arbitrations has not been raised until now before any court in India. Now, indeed there is ambiguity, but these ambiguities do create certain uncertainties around enforcement of investment arbitration awards. And if we look at Article 27.5 of the Model BIT 2016, that article provides a solution to this ambiguity by saying that the awards in case of investment arbitrations do amount to a commercial relationship in terms of the meaning given in Article 1 of the New York Convention. So therefore, it can be regarded as a welcome step in the new Model BIT. Now, however, there are indeed certain, since the ambiguity exists, there are certain questions that need to be answered, and the law on this needs to be settled so that the investor knows which law is the governing law in terms of when it comes to BIT arbitrations. So now there are certain questions that need to be considered, like how can exactly the law on this be settled? There are two ways primarily on this approaches that can be followed. One of them is that the Supreme Court can either answer these questions and settle these questions of law. The other one is that either the Parliament can pass an amendment and bring arbitration and conciliation, bring BIT arbitrations under the ambit of Arbitration and Conciliation Act. And I mean, there was one question which was posed by Rishabh sir around that: do we really care about foreign direct investment? I think the answer to that is that it is not about do we care about it. It's already going to be there. It is already coming to India, and therefore we need to come up with a system which sort of helps investors to navigate their way through the legal process that exists in our country. Thank you.
So thank you very much. Thank you, fellows. We have very short window for responding to the question. So initially, in case the panelists have any comments or response to the presentation, please go ahead and do that. And after that, there are one or two questions which has already come in. We can address those questions. So initially, if there is any response or comments that you would wish to kind of give the fellows. Thank you.
Rajesh, can I just come in?
Yeah, please go ahead. Please go ahead, Prabhash.
Yeah, no, I would like to compliment the fellows for their excellent presentation and the critical analysis of the model BIT, and also how the Indian courts are dealing with enforcement of BIT arbitral awards. I just have two quick comments firstly on what Shama mentioned about taxation exemption. I mean, just to sort of second what she said, the very purpose of having a BIT is to hold states accountable for exercising their sovereign powers. And while taxation is a very important sovereign power, undoubtedly, to exclude taxation completely from the purview of the BIT obviously gives too much power to the state. Even if we look at the investment treaty arbitration jurisprudence, we would find that the states the tribunals are deferential to the states when it comes to taxation. So they do not interfere with the power to tax unless or until the tax has been imposed in an arbitrary fashion or which is discriminatory. So there is already enough deference available in international law as far as taxation is concerned. Now, to put taxation completely outside the ambit of the BIT would obviously raise eyebrows in terms of how the state is going to deal with foreign investors. And secondly, very quickly on Rishabh's presentation, I think he has done a fascinating study, and I would encourage all of you to kindly read it. It's available, I think, on the website of the Center for Trade and Investment Laws. My own take is that I think it is now well established that FDI does play a very important role in economic development. I agree that there are and there could be downsides. It can't be a universal truth that FDI is brilliant in every single situation. But for countries like India, which are capital deficient, we do need FDI. I think that's pretty well settled because we domestically don't have that much of investment to make. And therefore, whether BITs lead to FDI inflows, that's the jury is still out on that question, and I don't think that we can answer it this way or that way convincingly at this stage. Thank you.
So, Shama, Rishabh, any comments on the presentation or otherwise?
No, just quickly from my side. No, the presentations were excellent. Again, they were quite doctrinal in their discussion about application of judicial precedent and all that. From my side, I say this whenever I speak to people who are sort of still in school or in university, or still deciding on their professional pursuits. Doctrinal law is not the end of it, and I think Prabhash can speak a lot to it because, he's not just doing doctrinal law, but he's doing sort of looking at it from a more broader sense. I often find that in this area, people approach things from the narrow sense of doctrinal law. So approaching it from the sense of what the courts have said, what the treaty might say, how it might be interpreted, and so on and so forth. I think it's very important that we look outside of that and ask ourselves broader questions, and unfortunately, practicing lawyers like myself would never really ask those questions because, we are sort of too saddled with the burden of applying those judgments and applying those case laws and treaties and statutes to our day-to-day practice. That's the training we have now. But all of you still have the benefit of being more open in your approach. So don't just ask yourself the question that the court has said X, therefore enforcement is Y, or the text of the treaty says this, therefore I have to apply it. Ask yourself why that text is there. Why is it important? Should it even be there? Ask yourself that if there is an enforcement regime, does that enforcement regime make sense in the first place? Again, just, it's not that difficult to realize that the enforcement regime that exists was built primarily for the perspective of enforcing commercial awards against private parties. Now, of course, you apply it to investment treaty awards against states as well, and you get into all those principles of sovereign immunity, etc. But ask yourself the questions that, is this the right regime? And if it's not, then it's not a matter of just sort of, saying that therefore it doesn't apply as a matter of law, but more that could there be a better regime? So I think that's just one point I wanted to make, but otherwise the presentations were great. And on Prabhash's points, I totally agree that I think the jury is sort of, out there now as far as benefits of FDI concerned. And therefore, me harping over that point is of no significance really, except that I think it again sort of goes back to asking yourself the very basic questions, right? That it came about for X reason, and what was that reason? And then you may want to even ask yourself the question, as Prabhash also said, that it may be that while FDI is generally good in a capital deficient country like us, but there are certain sectors where FDI is not good, or there are certain types of FDI which is not good. So for example, portfolio investments. Now, the main reason why we say FDI is good is because it brings with it capital, it brings with it technology transfer, it brings with it certain amount of employment, and so on and so forth. But portfolio investments don't bring any of it, and certainly doesn't bring the second and the third aspect of it. Now, should we provide protection to portfolio investments as well? Should we be in a position where the kind of case that the hedge fund TCI was planning to bring against Government of India because it had 1% or 2% shareholding in Coal India, should we be promoting those things? Now, again, you will only be able to question those things if you actually study the benefits, downsides or upsides of FDI, right? So ask yourself all those questions. That's the only point I would make. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. It's again, it's all about what kind of FDI that we are talking about, right? Shama, please go ahead.
No, I think Prabhash and Rishabh have made my job really easy as a person who's giving feedback last in the list. I completely second what Prabhash and Rishabh have said. This has been a wonderful panel discussion, not just a panel discussion, but also a presentation from students. It's really heartening to see the effort that students put in these really emerging new fields of law, especially for Indian colleges, where the focus has now moved from just Indian law to international law. So it's great to see young minds really applying the law as it stands, but also, as Rishabh said, asking questions. It's most important to ask questions on the existing law and to see how it can be better and to make good some of the flaws that still exist in our laws and even our interpretation of international law, because it's constantly evolving. So it's good to look at law from a space where you can analyze critically and also apply it in a better way. So thank you very much for this very engaging discussion, Professor Babu.
Yeah. So maybe we can take up one of the questions that has been put up in the chat window. I request Shama to kind of respond. Should I read it out? I'll read it out first for the benefit of everyone. Yeah. So the essential question is that two questions essentially. What are the panelists' view on the use of mediation and conciliation to resolve investor-state disputes, and the mediation rules proposed by ICSID? And the second question is, how serious is India on the attempt to resolve disputes through negotiation and mediation, given the dispute resolution structure in the model BIT? So 2 questions. So Shama first, and then anybody else want to kind of pitch in, please go ahead.
Sure. So let me deal with the first question. How effective is mediation and mediation and conciliation? I think there was a study which said, and I think if I'm correct, it was from the Investment Policy Hub, approximately 24% of existing BITs offer mediation or conciliation as an amicable alternative or a precondition to initiation of arbitration proceedings. Now, we all know that mediation offers several advantages. It could adopt various forms, such as facilitating not just a dialogue between the investor and the state on possible consequences of a potential state measure, but also opening a platform for free flow of options that are probably less restrictive or more proportionate for adoption by the state in order to mitigate investor impact. So mediation is an interest-based facilitation process rather than a rights-based adjudication system like arbitration, and has several advantages. It's cost-effective, it saves time, it is confidential. So the need for mediation in investment treaty disputes is, I think, more pressing than in international commercial disputes, considering that the goal is to have amicable relationship going forward between the investor and the state. Now, having said that, very few institutions have come up with rules targeted to investor-state disputes for mediation. The IBA rules for investor-state mediation were introduced way back in 2012, but at least I know only of one case under the auspices of the ICC which actually used the IBA rules for investor-state mediation. I'm going to refrain from commenting on the ICSID rules of mediation because I'm working on a project on this, but I would invite everybody once I'm ready with a report on this to look at that report. Coming to the second question on whether India is serious with mediation of disputes, I don't think we have a choice but to be serious with adoption of preventive measures before we can go in for adversarial measures, and we should be able to see at least even in the model BIT, we do have at least 6 months for negotiation, third-party procedures. So it is time that India becomes serious, and I believe it will be with mediation of these disputes.
Right. So any more comments, final comments, because we are already run out of time, right? So if there is anything left, no. Okay. Right. So a big thank you for first of all the panelists, and congratulations to Daksha Fellows and all the participants. Thank you very much, the organizers, for making this happen. It was indeed a great pleasure to be here and discuss extremely important issues. Thank you very much.
I'll just take a minute to thank all the panelists on behalf of Daksha Fellowship and Sai University. Thank you for taking your time out to attend the session on a working day. I think we had a very interesting bunch of discussions, and definitely we've made the case for another roundtable on this. And the idea of Daksha and Sai is to bridge the gap between the world of academics and practice. And so in future, again, we hope that we can host you for a similar discussion to explore and gain more perspectives and exchange ideas. Thank you very much. Once again, we look forward to hosting you again. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.